Good evening. My name is Shinyi Pai, and I'm the Program Director at Town Hall. On behalf of the staff at Town Hall Seattle and our friends at Finney Books, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual talk with Thor Hanson. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We're so glad you've joined us for tonight's virtual program, which will run about 60 minutes, including Q&A. To integrate our in-person and virtual audience experiences, we've changed the Q&A platform this year. To submit your question, please enter meet.ps/Hanson or scan the QR code right now on the screen with your smartphone. We'll drop this link in the chat and remind folks again in the audience when we get to Q&A about where to go. We can't guarantee that we'll be able to address every question, but we will try to get to as many as possible. For those who would like to view the program with closed captions, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming events include Martin Williams on the Sahara Desert Screener Days, Bill Schutz's Natural History of the Heart, and Susan Orlean on our relationship with animals. Visit our website to join our email list and get the latest updates as more programs are added throughout the season. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Arno G. Matulski Science Series is supported by Microsoft and Wyncote Foundation Northwest. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight. If you share in Town Hall's vision of a community energized and empowered by considering questions of politics, science, and culture, please consider supporting us by becoming a member. You'll find membership information on our website. Lastly, you'll definitely want to dive deeper into this evening's topic by purchasing a copy of Thor Hanson's book. The quickest way to do so is to visit the link in the chat below, which will take you directly to our friends at Finney Books. Thor Hanson is an author and biologist, a Guggenheim Fellow, a Switzer Environmental Fellow, and winner of the John Burroughs Medal. Hanson has written such books as Buzz, The Triumph of Seeds, Feathers, and others. He previously joined us at Town Hall to discuss the incredible world of bees, and tonight he'll tell us about his latest book, Hurricane Lizards and Plastic Squid, the fraught and fascinating biology of climate change. Please join me in welcoming Thor Hanson.
Thank you very much for that intro. I want to thank everyone at Town Hall for inviting me to join you this evening. And also thank all of you for tuning in. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to cross my fingers and make a small sacrifice to the Zoom gods and try to share my screen with all of you. Let's do that and see if that works. Good. Now I hope that you are seeing a picture of the cover of the book, Hurricane Lizards and Plastic Squid, that we'll be discussing here this evening. And I want to kick off our discussion with an image that I think we're all familiar with. It is the polar bear stranded on a melting iceberg. Now, this has become our go-to symbol for the biological impacts of climate change, so much so that the conversation all too often stops there. In the media and in all kinds of public discourse, we invoke the poor polar bear, and then we move on. After that dire warning, we move on, overlooking a vital biological backstory that really lies at the heart of all climate change scenarios. After all, it's not the change itself that matters so much as the responses to that change. If every species got along just as well under any conditions, then altering the weather wouldn't matter in the slightest. But of course, that's not how nature works. The diversity of life on Earth results from specialization, from the accumulation of species over time, all of which are adapted to particular environmental conditions. And when those conditions change, species react. And it is the sum of those reactions that will determine the future, theirs as well as ours. So this evening, I want to focus on the challenges that climate change creates for plants and animals, how we can already see and measure their responses. We can see them in the world around, we can see them in the backyard. Everywhere we look outside, we can see and measure those responses playing out all around us. We won't be talking a lot about the process of climate change itself, the atmospheric stuff, with one exception, one notable exception: carbon dioxide. Has there ever been a substance so often invoked, yet so seldom explained? Before I began this book project and all the research that it entailed, I realized that I hardly knew anything about the stuff that was making the planet warm in the first place. Good old carbon dioxide. In high school, I do recall that our chemistry textbook showed carbon dioxide as a big black ball, which was the carbon atom, surrounded by two, sort of bookended, if you will, by two red balls, which are the oxygen atoms. And at the time, I recall thinking that that looked precisely like the head of the red-eyed fruit fly that we had spent the past semester studying in our biology course. And that image really stuck with me. So that later, when the link between CO2 and climate change became so notorious, all I could picture was the smokestacks and tailpipes of the world emitting these clouds of red-eyed fruit flies, which was a very vivid image and a nice way to imagine climate change, but really didn't do much to help explain the situation. Because carbon dioxide is a bit of a paradox, isn't it? It is a global threat that also happens to be one of the building blocks for life on Earth. It's everywhere, which is why it was the first atmospheric gas ever to be described. In fact, before the discovery of carbon dioxide, scientists weren't even sure whether the atmosphere contained anything measurable at all. And credit for discovering CO2 goes largely to this fellow here, Joseph Priestley, who was an 18th century English clergyman. He was a chemist. He was a good friend of Benjamin Franklin. He was just an all-around polymath. And he, in turn, credits his discovery and his work on carbon dioxide to the fact that he was, quote, living for some time in the neighborhood of a public brewery. There, he found quantities of this colorless, odorless gas collecting above the fermentation vats. And he also found brewers who were patient enough to allow him to erect a scaffold over the top of the fermentation vats and then lower in all sorts of experiments. Now, he learned that it would snuff out a candle flame and that whatever it was heavy because it would carry the smoke from that flame down onto the brewery floor. He saw that small animals and insects could not breathe in the stuff, and he found that he could dissolve it in water, creating a fizzy beverage that he said had a pleasant, acidulous taste. And that breakthrough earned him the prestigious Copley Medal from the Royal Fellows, or the Fellows of the Royal Society, I should say, there in London. But it earned quite a lot more for entrepreneur Johann Schwepp, who copied Priestley's methods to found the tonic and soda water company that still bears his name. Now, Priestley's work paved the way for other experiments. Scientists soon learned that carbon dioxide would retain heat. And as early as the 1890s, they predicted that industrial activities were adding CO2 to the atmosphere in quantities large enough to warm the planet. That work was done in Sweden, however, where the idea of adding a few extra degrees to the atmosphere was generally greeted with gusto. Now, people have known then for a long time that CO2 was a greenhouse gas. Known that for quite a long time, but that still doesn't explain why some carbon dioxide is bad and why some of it is benign. To get my head around that distinction, I decided I needed to get my hands on some CO2. And the best place to find it, really, I discovered was in our refrigerator. So I want to share with you the story of that little discovery, which comes straight out of chapter 2 of the book. And this is a little experiment I conducted with my son Noah on the contents of our fridge. It begins with a quotation from Galileo, attributed to him by his biographer, who he said that we must measure all that is measurable and strive to make measurable all that is not. It turns out that fermentation occurs in a lot more places than vats of beer. Yogurt and cheese makers call it culturing, but it's more accurate to think of it as a form of slow microbial digestion. a way for bacteria and other tiny organisms to extract and use energy from the foods they live within and around. Like any form of digestion, it is a process that produces waste. Luckily for food lovers, the byproducts of fermentation include things like alcohol, thus the beer, and lactic acid, which adds tanginess and pungency to such cultured favorites as kimchi and buttermilk. Most fermentation also produces carbon dioxide, which is what had me combing through the back reaches of our fridge. A container of organic sauerkraut advertised probiotic punch and claimed it's alive. But any organisms that kraut might have once contained had long since shuffled off their mortal coils and were no longer producing any carbon dioxide. A lit match held above that briny mix burned brightly. Experiments with yogurt and sour cream were similarly disappointing, but then we hit the jackpot. On the bottom shelf, behind the bags of carrots and celery, sat a half-gallon jar of homemade pickles. They had been stewing in their own juices since August and tasted yeasty as well as sour, suggesting that fungi had joined the bacteria in their digestive pursuits. Frankly, it was far past time to throw the pickles out. But for once, procrastinating a chore paid off. As soon as Noah and I brought a match near that open lid, the flame demonstrated why carbon dioxide is such a common ingredient in fire extinguishers. With no oxygen to burn, the match went out in an instant, as if we'd turned off a switch. What's more, smoke from the snuffed tip curled downward, trapped in the gas just as Priestley had described. "It's pouring down the side," Noah exclaimed, watching as wisps of smoke followed the heavy vapors over the jar rim and down to spread across the countertop. "That's it," I told him. "You saw the carbon dioxide." He quickly brought me back to earth, reminding me that our quarry was invisible. "I didn't see the carbon dioxide, Papa. I saw the smoke." But like Priestley before us, we could use that smoke to watch the gas, defining its boundaries as it flowed and swirled around the open jar. For a few minutes, our kitchen was filled with the thrill of discovery as we lit match after match, watching them snuff and smolder until all the carbon dioxide had dissipated into the surrounding air. Simple experiments like that often lead to broader insights, and repeating Priestley's fermentation trick brought up an obvious question. Do pickles cause climate change? Does brewing beer? The answer, of course, is no. But understanding why some carbon emissions are harmless while others are not reveals a basic truth about climate change that we rarely stop to think about. In the case of our pickle jar, the carbon came from the cucumbers in the brine, and the cucumbers had gotten it from the air around our garden the previous summer. Like plants everywhere, their growth relied on photosynthesis, that leafy process of combining carbon dioxide with water and energy from the sun to create starches. In other words, carbon dioxide puts the carbo in carbohydrates. When those starches break down, the carbon dioxide goes back into the atmosphere. That is the step in the Earth's carbon cycle with which we are most familiar, because we play a role in it every moment of every day. Whether we eat plants or eat animals that have eaten plants, the energy that fuels our bodies traces right back to those photosynthetic starches, and we release carbon dioxide with every exhaled breath. But in terms of climate change, breathing is like making pickles or brewing beer, guilt-free. That's because our bodies are just one short stop for carbon on its continuous circuit from the air through plants and animals and back again, with no net gain or loss. If that's all there was to the story, then the planet wouldn't be warming and I wouldn't be giving this lecture. The reality of modern climate change hinges on one key fact. Not all plants break down. Consider the pickle. Cucumbers eaten fresh or left to rot in the garden release their carbon right away. But that process slows down considerably in a jar of salty brine. Under the right conditions, it can stop altogether. In nature, this occurs primarily in two locations, the ocean floor and boggy wetlands. When marine algae die en masse and sink to the seabed, they sometimes get buried before they are eaten or decomposed. Dead plants in bogs can also accumulate with little decay, forming layer upon layer of peat. In either case, If sedimentary rocks develop above and around these organic deposits, their carbon is effectively trapped and removed from the atmosphere for millions of years. Transformed by heat, pressure, and age, we recognize these ancient plants as the fossil fuels. Petroleum from the algae, coal from the peat, and natural gas, which can come from either. Burning them now returns all of that stockpiled carbon to the atmosphere at once, overwhelming the natural cycle and leading to all the many consequences now unfolding. So the next time you find something at the back of the fridge that looks like a scientific experiment, it is a scientific experiment. There's a lot to be learned there in the refrigerator. And it's a good reminder that even the atmospheric aspects of modern climate change are rooted in biology. Now, let me do one quick thing to my screen and we'll get right back into it. Gonna do that. Okay. And now go back here. We know that the climate is warming, and we know why it's warming. But what does all of that mean for plants and animals? As you can imagine, this is a booming field of study, a booming field. Climate impacts are so widespread that it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that all biologists are studying climate change. Some of them just don't know it yet. It helps to organize that deluge of information into themes, and one of the most common themes has to do with timing. At Walden Pond, for example, the violets and wood sorrel that Henry David Thoreau admired in May and June now bloom by late April. And what he called that early yellow smell of willows can reliably be savored in March. Spring is arriving earlier and earlier. You can see it happen in your own backyard. And if you write your observations down, as Thoreau did, they might one day become valuable. His meticulous notes on the plants and birds at Walden are now a vital baseline for modern comparisons. One expert told me that if Thoreau was listed as a co-author on all of the papers using his data, he would be one of the most prolific climate change scientists of the 21st century. But a modern spring isn't just earlier than what Thoreau saw, it's different. To Thoreau, it might seem like a season in disarray. That's because not all species are responding in the same ways or even at the same times. This flower, for example, is a familiar sight in meadows throughout the Pacific Northwest. It is known as death camas. Like many plants, it produces toxins to ward off would-be attackers. But unlike most other plants, it doesn't just put those chemicals into leaves and seeds and other places likely to be nibbled. It puts them everywhere, including in its pollen and nectar. What's more, the main toxin in that mix, zygosine, is especially nasty stuff. It attacks the heart, it attacks the lungs, and for good measure, it attacks the digestive tract. The Latin name of the plant really says it all. Toxicoscordion venenosum venenosum. Poisonous bulb, poisonous, poisonous. So death camas is very well protected, but in terms of pollination, it's in a bit of a bind. I mean, how do you attract insects to your flowers when instead of a tasty reward, you're offering them seizures and paralysis and eventually death? Enter the appropriately named death camas bee, one of only a handful of species and the only bee that has figured out a way to detoxify death camas poison. That gives the bee an exclusive source of pollen and nectar, and it gives the flower a very dedicated pollinator. It is a tight, co-evolved, codependent relationship. But in many locations, death camas is now blooming weeks earlier than it did just 30 years ago, responding to the steady rise in springtime air temperatures. The bee, on the other hand, nests in the ground where temperatures are warming more slowly. And it's still on the old schedule. If that trend continues, it threatens to pull these two codependent species apart, not in space, but in time. Specialized relationships like pollination are particularly vulnerable to what biologists call these timing mismatches, these species on different trajectories. But it's happening in a wide range of situations, including unexpected things like caribou. Migrating herds of caribou headed toward their calving grounds, in some cases now are arriving late, past the peak of the plant productivity that they were going to be relying upon to raise their young. Similarly, there are migrating songbirds now missing the key bursts of activity, if you will, in tide flats where they stop to refuel on their way. The invertebrates that they extract from the mud have passed their peak of productivity already by the time the birds arrive. But it can take decades or longer for the results of these mismatches to really play out before we can really measure and see what's happening. In some cases, the impacts of climate change are much more immediate, particularly when we're talking about extremes in weather, increasingly harsh climatic conditions that simply push species beyond their comfort zones. The storms and the floods, the droughts, the heat waves like we experienced here in the Northwest this past summer. As one expert told me, sometimes it's pretty simple. Organisms just get too hot. And one such example comes to us from the deserts of the American Southwest, where you might expect creatures to be well prepared for a warmer world. This story comes from Barry Sinervo, who is a herpetologist at UC Santa Cruz. The western fence lizard, which, if your childhood was anything like mine, is a species you may have tried and failed to catch, because the fence lizard would always scamper under a nearby rock and evade my clutches. But it turns out that fence lizards use rocks for a lot more than getting away from young lizard enthusiasts. They are what herpetologists would call heliotherms. They get their body heat, regulate their body temperature using the sun. And they bask on top of rocks to get warm, and then they hide beneath rocks to cool off. They can't just stay out in the sun indefinitely because they lack the ability to compensate for that increasing temperature. They would overheat and ultimately perish. So they always stay close to rocks so they can cool off when they need to. And that means that as the temperature has risen across their habitat, particularly in desert areas, the lizards have responded by doing what they've always done on hot days. They go under rocks. They spend more time in the shade. But that comes with a cost, because the more time you spend hiding beneath rocks, the less time you have to go out and search for food. So as temperatures have risen, the calories taken in by lizards have started to go down. Now, Barry and his team had watched populations of fence lizards wink out at a number of hot sites before they realized that it wasn't the heat killing the lizards directly. What was happening was they were spending so much time in the shade that they weren't getting enough to eat, and the females particularly could not build up the energy reserves within their bodies necessary to reproduce. In other words, when it got too hot, the lizards stopped breeding. And you don't need a PhD in herpetology to figure out the long-term consequences of that. Another climate change challenge out there has to do with what fans of the Jungle Book might call the bare necessities, the simple bare necessities of life. What happens when some critical aspect of a species' habitat just disappears? Now, this is what we are talking about with polar bears. Melting pack ice, the disappearance of pack ice, deprives the bears of the place where they hunt for seals like this one. But if we could look beyond that ice to the edges of it, we might catch sight of another creature in the Arctic that's being affected by this trend. A little seabird called the little auk or dovekie that feeds on the edge of the pack ice where the waters are particularly rich in plankton. Now, that was a great strategy until the ice began to dwindle and retreat from places like Franz Josef Land archipelago in Russia, where the dovekies breed. Now, scientists long predicted that dovekies would be an early casualty of climate change, because as the ice retreated farther and farther in spring and summer, the dovekies would have to fly all that distance to reach a place where they could forage and then fly all the way back to bring food to their chicks, eventually leading to starvation and reproductive failure and population collapse. Which brings us to an important point. Nature is not defenseless. Nature is not a passive bystander. Species react, and sometimes they do so in ways that we would never predict. So I want to catch up then with the story of dovekies with a conversation that I had with a fellow named David Grimillet, who is a French scientist, and he participated in an expedition up to Franz Josef Land to study a remote dovekey breeding colony. We had indeed strong hypotheses and predictions on how they would behave, Grimillet explained, noting that birds in their previous studies had flown over 60 miles to reach the edge of the pack ice. We were expecting flight times between the colony and the foraging spot of at least an hour, he went on, and then he recounted what he called, quote, one of the most exciting moments in my research career. Sitting with their laptops at the dinner table, surrounded by their Russian counterparts, his team opened up the first batch of tracking data and saw precisely how long the birds had been in the air. Less than 4 minutes. Instead of trekking all the way to the edge of the sea ice, the dovekies had apparently found an alternative food source right on their doorstep. But what and where? It's easy to imagine the excited conjecture and conversation that came next, perhaps fortified by a sip or two of vodka. Soon their ideas began to coalesce around an entirely new theory. My colleague, Jérôme Fraught, remembered what we had seen while climbing the nearby mountain with our Russian friends a week before, Grimillet recalled, and described a distinct line across the mouth of the fjord where cloudy blue meltwater from island glaciers slammed into dark, dense currents from the Atlantic Ocean, or from the Arctic Ocean, I should say. Both Fraught and Grimillet had trained as oceanographers before they started studying birds, so they knew the consequences of such an abrupt transition. We both knew what this front meant, a curtain of plankton killed by temperature and osmotic shock. For tiny crustaceans, swimming so suddenly from one kind of water into another was like driving full speed into a wall. And for anything that fed upon those crustaceans, the resulting pileup created a bonanza. Testing their theory, on the other hand, was going to require a boat, and the only craft available at the research station was a, quote, chronically deflated dinghy. To make matters worse, the fuel they had brought from Murmansk turned out to be contaminated with water. None of this was exactly promising for a polar expedition onto the sea, but they set off anyway and managed to sputter and splutter far enough out into the fjord for a survey. There wasn't much to see at first, but as they crossed the convergence between glacial melt and ocean water, suddenly the dovekies were all around them. The little auks were all there, Grimillet told me, aligned on the oceanic side, diving and stuffing themselves on plankton, easily picked from that underwater curtain. With that revelation, the story of dovekies and climate change switched instantly from one of decline to one of resilience. Yes, the sea ice was melting as predicted, but so were Arctic glaciers. And in places like Franz Josef Land, where glaciers are plentiful, that created an opportunity that nobody saw coming. Grimillet and his team spent the remainder of their field season showing that dovekies weren't just surviving on their new food source, they were thriving. Chicks grew at precisely the same rate as they had on a traditional diet, measured decades earlier at the very same location. To Grimillet, the project demonstrated how one overlooked detail can change the entire outcome. Even if you think that you know, he summarized, you really have to get out into the field to check on what wild creatures are doing, because they very often surprise you. Now, David Grimillet's story embodies something that I heard again and again during my research for this book, how scientists went into the field expecting to study one thing and ended up studying something else, because conditions on the ground were so different from what they expected. Different in terms of climate, but also different in terms of the lives and the activities of their study subjects. The dovekies were able to pivot quickly to a new food source because they have what scientists call plasticity, just like the old comic book character Plastic Man, who could bend his body into any shape at the drop of a hat. Well, in an era of climate change, we all wish that species everywhere were like Plastic Man, with that ability to bend their habits to meet these new conditions. They're not all that flexible, but some of them are incredibly flexible. And if there were an Olympian of plasticity in nature, it might just be the Humboldt squid, a creature that can bend not only its behaviors, but can bend even its lifestyle to the point of changing its whole body. Now, people thought that Humboldt squid had disappeared from traditional feeding grounds and fishing grounds in the Gulf of California down off of Mexico. People had been fishing there for decades. Suddenly, there were these waves of marine heat coming in, climate-driven marine heat waves, and the squid disappeared. No one could catch a squid. And everyone figured, well, they've left. They've departed for cooler waters. They're highly mobile species, and they've just gone north or gone out farther to sea, and we won't be catching them anymore. But then they went out and did some surveys and found that, in fact, the squid were still there, even more abundant than they had been previously. But rather than departing, they had changed their lifestyles completely in response to heat stress. They were maturing twice as fast. They were eating different foods. They were living only half as long. They were reproducing in half the time. And under those constraints, their adult bodies could only reach a fraction of the size that they had been previously. Too small, in fact, to bite on the hooks that the fishers had traditionally been using to catch them. And the few they could hook, they had assumed were juveniles or maybe even a different species, and they were just throwing them back. But the squid looked so different in response to that warm water. Now, most of the responses that we've measured to date in nature are some version of the dove-key or the squid story, changes in behavior or in physiology that were the results of plasticity, already baked in to those species' genetic codes. They're capable of doing that already. A good way to think about that is to consider the recent Olympics and how athletes from around the world descended upon Tokyo for the Olympics and the Paralympics, and many of them did so literally. They had been training at high altitude because the human body is plastic as well. And if you go up into mountains to train, the air is less dense, so every breath that you take contains fewer molecules of oxygen. But the body has a way to compensate it, produces more red blood cells, alters your blood flow and breathing slightly so that you can live normally at those high elevations. Well, when you come down to sea level as an elite athlete, with that increase in the movement of oxygen through your blood, you get a little boost out of that. You're getting more oxygen to your muscles, and it can make a small difference in your performance. That is plasticity. We have it. A lot of species in nature have it to one degree or another. And that's mostly what we've seen now in terms of climate change responses. But there are a few tantalizing examples of where we're beginning to see evolution in response to climate change, and it's happening fast. Now, one of the best examples comes to us from the Caribbean and from another lizard, if you can stand another lizard story. This is a wonderful little lizard that lives in the Turks and Caicos Islands in the Caribbean. And Colin Donahue, who's now at Washington University, had just surveyed populations of this little lizard as part of a larger project going on in the islands. They were going to remove the non-native rats, the Norway rats that were living there and eating all sorts of things, including lizards. So the idea was you go out and you survey the native plants and animals, you remove the rats, and then you come back and you do additional studies and see how the ecosystem has responded. So that was the plan. But then a hurricane struck and Colin's research took an unexpected turn. So I want to share with you that story, which comes out of chapter 8 from the book, which also begins with a quotation, this time from Giuseppe Lampedusa's novel, The Leopard. And he wrote, "If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change." Actually, it was two hurricanes Donahue clarified, when I called to ask him how the story had played out. Hurricane Irma struck first, pummeling the eastern Caribbean with torrential rains, storm surge, and Category 5 winds exceeding 175 miles per hour. Just 2 weeks later, Hurricane Maria swept through with similar force. The combined storms devastated low-lying islands like the ones where Donahue's lizards lived, uprooting trees, flattening structures, and leaving both natural and human communities reeling. Needless to say, researchers put the rat project on an indefinite hold. But for Donahue, that setback also offered an opportunity. While his questions about lizards and rats would have to wait, he was now in the perfect position to study the effects of hurricanes. Had any lizards survived? And if so, were they different? We had no idea what to expect, he told me, but I knew we weren't going to get another chance at that kind of data. So he cobbled together some funding, headed back to the Caribbean, and found himself in a sort of scientific deja vu, repeating the exact same field project he'd just completed 6 weeks earlier. We were on a short timeline, so it was pretty much catching and measuring lizards all day long, Donahue recalled, but he described the trip with obvious pleasure, as if this were precisely how anyone would want to spend their time on a tropical island. In conversation, Donahue's enthusiasm for science borders on exuberance. He comes across as someone who probably keeps working and thinking long after other people might quit for the day and retire to the poolside bar. That may be why he recognized the value of returning so soon to resurvey his lizards. And it's almost certainly why he thought to bring along a leaf blower. The customs officer was very confused, he said, and laughed out loud at the memory of trying to explain the science behind traveling with a large piece of landscaping equipment. We needed to know how the lizards behaved in hurricane-force wind, he told me. It was possible they might run for it or hunker down in the tree roots. We didn't know. And since watching lizards in a real hurricane was out of the question, Donahue used the leaf blower to simulate one inside his hotel room. And I have to say, I've always wondered what the people in the next room thought about that. I mean, it's one thing if someone turns on the TV loud, but a leaf blower. Well, at any rate, Colin was kind enough to share pictures from that experiment so that we can all see what he saw when he turned on that leaf blower. And before I show you these pictures, I want to assure you that no lizards were harmed in the experiment. He had a soft net set up off camera so that the lizards were all safely captured and then released back into the wild, same day, unharmed. So let's take a look now at what happens. There's your lizard. You bring it into your hotel room and you put it on a stick and you turn on the breeze, and you can see how the hind legs start to slip when the wind increases. We're up at 108 miles per hour, and now the whole lizard is flapping in the wind like a flag, holding on for dear life until finally it lets go and exits. So to Donahue, seeing that in action was a revelation because it explained what he was seeing in his data. The surviving lizards were indeed different than the ones he had measured 6 weeks earlier. The survivors shared certain characteristics. They had larger, measurably larger toe pads for hanging on tight to sticks and branches, and they had stronger front legs for gripping those sticks and branches. It made perfect sense, and it even explained why their back legs were shorter, because when they're flapping like a flag in the wind, the short back legs have less drag, and they can hold on just a little bit longer. And that may be all it takes to survive a hurricane. So what he had witnessed and documented was natural selection in action, survival of the fittest, if you will. And he returned later to see how those traits were being passed on to the next generation. Then he looked broadly at the whole Caribbean, and he could see that wherever hurricanes were more frequent, the lizard populations had those very same traits. So what Donahue documented, instead of the effects of rats, was the effects of hurricane force winds, the effects of climate change, driving evolution, not over the course of hundreds or thousands of years, but over the course of a single field season. So climate change biology is full of those kinds of revelations and surprises. And I hope you will agree with me that there's a lot more to it than a polar bear on an iceberg. It's a complicated and rich subject. We've been talking about everything from timing mismatches in nature to the effects of extreme weather. We've talked about plasticity, even evolution. And I have to tell you, we haven't even scratched the surface. Consider movement, which may be the most intuitive response to climate change of all, for those creatures capable of doing so, pulling up stakes and spreading out across the landscape or through the ocean to find the temperatures and other, climatic factors that you're used to. This is one of the most common responses, and between 25 and 85% of the species on the planet are doing just that. Scientists have already documented over 30,000 range shifts in response to climate change, an incredible reassortment of life on the planet, which is in turn causing these upheavals in all sorts of relationships, creating novel ecosystems with species that aren't accustomed to one another. It's changing things like predation and competition and hybridization, all sorts of fundamental ecological processes, yes, including extinction. The mouse-like brambleKey melomies, for example, recently became the first confirmed mammal lost to the climate crisis when all of its known habitat off the coast of Australia was inundated by sea level rise. So studying climate change biology doesn't make scientists worry less about the crisis, but it can help them to worry smart. Understanding which species are more resilient and which are more vulnerable for the purposes of triage. Allocating scarce resources in terms of research, in terms of policy, in terms of conservation effort towards the species that need our help the most. And that's also important at a personal level for all of us as we try to allocate our limited emotional capital to this crisis. We need to know what to worry about. Yes, climate change is a daunting crisis, but I argue that it deserves our curiosity as well as our concern. After all, it's hard to solve a problem if you aren't even interested in it. Now, in a few minutes, I want to take your questions, but first, let me end with a passage from the conclusion to the book that also begins with a quotation, this time from the bard himself, from Shakespeare, who wrote in King John, "Strong reasons make strong actions." I subscribe to a philosophy expressed to me by Gordon Orions, an eminent American biologist whose 7-decade career has spanned everything from blackbird behavior to the evolution of fear. When asked what a concerned scientist, or a concerned citizen, I should say, should do to combat climate change, his response was immediate and concise: everything you can. In that simple phrase, Orion's managed to capture both urgency and agency, the seriousness of the issue combined with the importance of taking action at a relevant scale. It's not a new idea. 19th century thinker Edward Everett Hale expressed something similar in a verse conceived long before anyone was worried about their carbon footprint. "I cannot do everything, but still I can do something," he wrote. "And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can do." The value of the advice from both Orions and Hale lies in their choice of the word can, a verb rooted in possibility and adaptable to any circumstance. It helps us focus our energy on tasks immediately at hand, tangible things like how we drive, shop, eat, travel, protest, vote, dry the laundry, or even cut the grass. Naysayers will claim that personal action is trivial, that it's an empty gesture in the face of a problem so large. But that position is wrong. And not just slightly wrong, it is the opposite of the truth. In nature, we have seen how the responses of individual organisms determine the fates of populations, of species, and of entire ecological communities. The same pattern applies to society. Addressing climate change requires a fundamental cultural shift in our relationship with energy, from how we produce it to how much of it our lifestyles demand. That makes individual action more important, not less so, because by definition, changing a culture requires the accumulated changes of the individuals that create that culture. Yes, we need stronger climate policies. We need strong leadership to carry them forward, but those things will largely be the results of cultural change, not the cause of it. Doing everything we can about climate change is also a fitting approach biologically, because that is precisely what plants and animals are doing. Their responses are playing out all around us every day, a constant thrumming call to action. Because in spite of the complexity of our societies and the technologies that we surround ourselves with, in the end, we're just one more species on a changing world, facing the same climate challenges and drawing on the same basic toolbox of potential solutions, with one notable difference. Unlike any other organism on the planet, people have the ability to do something more than simply react to climate change. If we so choose, we can alter the behaviors that are causing it to happen. With that, I want to thank you for your attention. Thank the people who've loaned me images for the presentation, and then switch it over to any questions you may have. And I think Faith is going to help us with the questions.
Yes, I am, Thor. Thank you so much for that very vivid presentation. Those images really brought up some thoughts and emotions, especially the fruit flies. I can't tell you they were good, but that is what the point, that was the point of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you
Yeah.
enjoyed the fruit flies.
Yes. Oh gosh, yes. It's burned in there forever. I think this is a good question to start with, and it is, when did you know you wanted to take this work seriously? Was it at a young age that you felt passionate about biology slash climate change?
Oh, that's a great question. And I've always had an interest in nature. I was the kid, with the, catching snakes and raising tadpoles into frogs and those sorts of things. Loved the outdoors, but didn't really consider myself on a track to be a scientist until I departed for university. I was raised here in the Northwest and spent a lot of time outdoors. And I went to college down in Southern California in a landscape that was very heavily impacted at the time, still is, urban sprawl, but then also with very severe air pollution. And going so suddenly from the Northwest to that environment showed me how much threat we were under in terms of natural landscapes. And it really steered me towards a path in conservation biology. And so that experience, made me take what had been, more of an avocation of being outdoors and loving nature, and turned it into a career.
That's lovely. When did you go to the Caribbean for the first time?
Oh, well, luckily I've had the chance to study overseas in a lot of different settings.
Okay.
And I have done work in the tropics in Africa, and I've done work in Central America. Of course, I should couch this now by saying this is one of the dichotomies we struggle with as scientists. If we are jetting off to do a conservation project on another continent, creating this great carbon footprint,
right,
while we go off to do work that we hope is helping the planet, there's a real disconnect there. And it takes, a lot of, you're not going to offset all of those carbon emissions by carpooling to the airport, or recycling your yogurt bins or something.
Yeah.
So there's a real struggle that we all have to define which situations are important enough to justify the harm that we cause the planet when we study it. And so I've done a lot of overseas work. These days, I'm sticking a lot closer to home.
Yeah, that's nice. That's nice to hear. Here's another question. What has been the most surprising thing you've encountered while on your journey?
Surprises. So many. It's hard to pick one. I think with this climate change project, the surprises just keep coming. And it has to do with how all these scientists, and any of us, go out into nature and are surprised by seeing things that seem out of whack. You go to study one thing and it's totally different when you get there. And one of my favorites that I encountered for the book project was a project by a fellow named Will Deasy, who was on Kodiak Island in Alaska studying brown bears. He has a passion for the big brown grizzly bears there on Kodiak. And he was fascinated by how they always seemed to be at the right stream at the right time. He wanted to understand how they moved from watershed to watershed so that they were there for peak salmon abundance. So he'd gone up and he had radio tagged 40 brown bears, and he had, he was counting salmon in the streams. He had this big team working on all this stuff, and everything was going great right in the middle of salmon season when all the bears disappeared.
Oh, wow.
They just were gone. And they looked at it and said, well, where are the bears? We got salmon. Where are the bears?
Yeah, they're big.
And yeah, I mean, they just weren't there. I said, luckily, they had some radio tags on these things. And he said, well, we'll follow them and find out what they're doing. And so they followed these bears up into the hills and found them feasting on red elderberries.
Oh.
Now, bears eat berries. That's been known. But everyone had assumed that salmon was their favorite food in that landscape and was the reason they were so large on Kodiak, this abundance of fish. So what that observation led them to understand then was that this particular berry, the red elderberry, was flowering and fruiting earlier and earlier in the year because of the warming temperatures. So it had plasticity. It was responding early, right? And fruiting. And the bears, which had always eaten elderberry in the fall, they loved the elderberries so much that they used their behavioral plasticity, the ability to change, to simply track those berries and go to them when they were ripe. And they preferred the berries over the salmon because the berries had a combination of protein and carbohydrates. And this explains, why something people have observed for decades, really, with bears and salmon is that, yes, they love salmon, but they often will eat only parts of the salmon. They'll eat the brain, or they'll peel off the skin, or they'll eat out the belly and leave a lot of the flesh behind, because the diet is so high powered in terms of protein that they can't really put on fat eating straight protein. I mean, they need more of a mix in their diet. I mean, this is the same principle as people on the Atkins diet or the South Beach diet, when all you eat is protein and you lose all this weight. Well, yes, it's true, because physiologically you can't put on body fat on protein alone, or you can put very little on. And that's the same is true for the bears. So they need those carbohydrates. And what they found in the elderberries was a mix of protein and carbohydrates that was almost like the perfect bear food. They'd always been eating it, but people didn't realize how important it was until climate change forced the bears to choose.
Yeah, well, I didn't know bears could be so picky.
Yeah, I mean, things like you see them in the garbage can, they'll eat anything. But turns out if you set them at a buffet line, they want about 15% protein and the rest carbohydrates. So that's what they like.
Wow, well, that is surprising. Next question is, with carbon dioxide levels soaring higher than ever before, but with more people involved working with climate change, do we have a good grasp on saving our planet? What needs to happen?
Oh, yeah, great question. So we're talking about a certain amount of change that's already baked into this system, because carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for decades or even a couple of centuries. And we put so much up there. We've added this stuff that was stored in the ground into the current carbon cycle at a rate that it can't keep up with. So it's built up and it retains heat. And we know we've done that already. So the most crucial thing that we can do now, and what you will be reading about in the newspaper continuously now that climate change meetings coming up the end of the month and next month, is how do we reduce the amount we're adding? Because the more you put up there, the worse the effects long term. So the idea now is to try to reduce the amount we're putting in, and ultimately to reduce the impacts. There's a lot of research going on if there are ways to actually remove some of the carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere. So there's a lot going, sort of an all of the above approach right now, but the most critical thing is to reduce what we're putting in. And that's why you see such an emphasis on getting away from fossil fuels, getting away from coal and gas towards renewables like electricity, and so forth, wind power, solar power, these kinds of things. And a part of it, and I think it's often not explained or not emphasized enough in those discussions, is how personal choices play a role in that. So it's not just producing energy cleanly, but using less of it, And I will, you can humor me. I'm a Northwest kid, lots of relations, back in Ballard in the day and so forth. So with a name like Thor Hanson, you can imagine there are some Norwegian jokes that go around in my family. So I will explain this if I can, bear with me, by using an old Norwegian joke. And that was the joke of old Ole in North Dakota, who was a farmer, beloved by his family, lived a wonderful life there. And when he was passing away, he was on his deathbed in the farmhouse, and the whole family had gathered in the room with him to say their final goodbyes. And Ole said, "Well, is Lena here?" And they said, "Oh, Lena's here, Ole. Yes, everyone is here." And he said, "Well, what about Lars?" And they said, "Yes, Ole, Lars is here in the room. We're all here with you." And then he started going through the people in the family, all these names, and they realized he was getting kind of agitated. And they finally said, "No, Ole, everyone, the whole family is here in the bedroom with you." And he said, "Well, why is the light on in the kitchen?" And the humor of the joke is sort of the frugality of Norwegian farmers, if you will. Right. But the only reason that it's funny at all, or the only reason that someone would make a joke like that, is because energy was so precious that people would worry about a light on in another room. We forget that the rural electrification, in this country, that act passed in 1936. So it's within a lifetime ago that electricity was widespread in rural areas in this country. And when it came, it was a precious, precious resource, and people worried about the lights on in any room. And now I challenge you at the end of this lecture to look around your apartment or your house and see how many things are on just constantly that we don't think about. We've lost that mentality of energy as a precious resource. And I think that dealing with climate change at a personal level, a part of what we can do is relearn that idea that energy is precious and we need to be frugal, like old Ole.
Yeah, there's a pretty specific question, which I feel goes with what I just asked, but it says, what little things could we do that could really help our environment? And is one of them turning off the lights, as you said, and just making sure everything is off and, unplugged?
Absolutely. All of those little things, they matter in the accumulation of society. If we all start doing that stuff, it makes a real difference. Mm-hmm. And the analogy that I like in this case is how if you have a friend who's going through a bad patch and you want to help them, you can't fix whatever the problem is. Maybe there's been a death in the family, or something that is beyond your ability to just snap your fingers and fix, but you want to help them. Well, climate change is it's a big problem. You can't do it all yourself, but you want to help, right? Yeah. And so if it's your friend, maybe you cook them a meal, maybe you mow the grass, or you go and do some errands that they don't have time to do, and it helps. They really appreciate it. And part of that is that you feel better having done something to help. And what I find with these, questions about energy use and climate change is if you find something that you can do to help, you feel a little better. And in science, we have a name for that kind of thing. It's called a positive feedback loop, right? Something that feeds back to more of the same kind of activity. Because if you do something that feels good, you want to do more of it. And I find that is true with these habits that can help us all address climate change in our own lives. And that accumulation will have a massive impact culturally.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Your energy is booming, and it's so full of lights, even though we're talking about turning those off when we're not using them, but you're always on, and I really appreciate that, and I'm sure it was fun for the audience to be a part of this as well, so thank you.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you all have a good evening.
Oh, good. Yes, and for our audience at home, remember to pick up a copy of the book from our friends over at Finney Books, and that link can be found in the chat. Thank Thank you so much for being here, Thor, and thank you to our audience for joining us today at Town Hall. Have a good night.